General Xerac stood at the edge of the landing bay, staring down at the blue-green planet below. Earth, a primitive world by galactic standards, yet its people had drawn attention from the Zorthan Empire. They were a young species, still limited to their single star system, yet they had resisted every attempt at control. The Empire had sent spies, diplomats, and even threats, but the humans remained defiant. Now, Xerac had been sent on a personal mission. He would inspect their military academy, study their warriors, and determine if they were truly a threat or just another race that would fall under the Empire's might. The shuttle descended through the planet's atmosphere, shaking slightly as it cut through the thick air. Xerac remained still, his glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. He had conquered dozens of worlds, witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and never once had he doubted the superiority of his people. The Zorthans were larger, stronger, and had centuries of combat experience. These humans, with their soft bodies and short lifespans, could not possibly compare. The shuttle landed with a dull thud inside the Earth Military Academy's main compound. The hatch hissed open, and Xerac stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the concrete ground. Human soldiers stood in formation, watching him with expressionless faces. They were smaller than Zorthans, physically weaker, yet there was something unsettling about their posture. They stood perfectly still, their hands resting near their weapons, eyes locked onto him without fear. Most species cowered in the presence of a Zorthan warlord. These humans did not. A human general approached, his uniform crisp, his face lined with age and experience. "Welcome to Earth's Military Academy," he said, his voice steady. "I am General Carter." He extended a hand, a human greeting. Xerac hesitated, then reached out, his large, clawed fingers grasping the human's hand. The grip was firm, stronger than expected. This old man had seen war. Xerac released his hand and glanced around. "This is where you train your warriors." His voice was deep, filled with skepticism. Carter nodded. "You'll see soon enough." He turned, motioning for Xerac to follow. They walked through the academy grounds, passing squads of soldiers running drills. Xerac observed them closely. Their movements were efficient, their formations tight. He had expected sloppiness, yet these humans moved with precision. In the distance, a group was engaged in hand-to-hand combat training. Xerac stopped to watch. Two cadets circled each other in a ring, their uniforms stained with sweat. One lunged forward, striking fast. The other dodged, countered, and in a split second, the first cadet was on the ground, his arm twisted behind him. The defeated soldier didn't cry out, didn't complain. He simply nodded, stood up, and prepared to fight again. Xerac narrowed his eyes. "Your soldiers recover quickly." Carter smirked. "Pain is a lesson. The faster they learn, the stronger they become." Xerac had seen training before, but something about this was different. Most species relied on physical superiority, raw power. The humans relied on something else. Endurance, willpower. They didn't stop when hurt. They didn't hesitate when faced with pain. They kept going. Carter led him further into the academy, toward a large building. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and sweat. It was a weapons testing facility. Human engineers worked on advanced firearms, testing them against reinforced targets. Xerac watched as a soldier picked up a rifle, aimed, and fired. The blast tore through solid steel. Impressive, but not surprising. The Empire had seen energy weapons before, but then the soldier switched to a different weapon. Something smaller, something ancient. He fired again. A projectile, not energy. A simple, physical bullet. It shouldn't have been remarkable, yet Xerac felt uneasy. The humans still used primitive weapons, but they wielded them with terrifying precision. They had perfected war in ways the Empire never had. Zorthans relied on technology, shields, and enhancements. Humans relied on skill. Carter turned to him. "You look surprised." Xurek crossed his arms. I did not expect your kind to still use such primitive tools. Carter chuckled. It's not the tool that matters. It's the one using it. The words lingered in Xurek's mind as they continued the tour. The academy was vast, filled with training grounds, strategy rooms, and barracks. Every corner held another display of human discipline and determination. Xurek had expected arrogance, but there was none. These soldiers did not boast, did not show off. They simply trained endlessly, pushing themselves past exhaustion. Then came the final test. Carter led him to an underground chamber, where a group of elite soldiers stood waiting. They wore no armor, carried no weapons. Carter turned to Xurek. We call this the gauntlet. Our best fighters face off against multiple opponents. No breaks, no mercy. The challenge began. A single soldier stepped forward. 3 others attacked him at once. Xurek watched, expecting the lone fighter to be overwhelmed. But he wasn't. He moved like a predator, dodging, striking, countering. His movements were calculated, precise, and brutal. Bones cracked, bodies hit the ground, yet the human did not stop. Blood dripped from his face, but he kept fighting. Even when he was exhausted, even when he could barely stand, he fought. Xurek felt something he had not felt in years. Unease. Carter leaned in. Now do you see? Strength isn't just about muscle. It's about will. And humans, we do not break. Xurek said nothing. He had come here expecting to find weakness. Instead, he had found something far more dangerous. A species that refused to surrender. A species that did not fear pain. A species that would fight, no matter the cost. For the first time in his long military career, General Xurek wondered if the Zorthan Empire had made a mistake. General Xurek could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in his mind. As he followed General Carter through the academy grounds, his sharp eyes studied every soldier, every drill, every test of endurance. There was something unnatural about these humans, not in their biology, but in their spirit. Other species had powerful warriors, but they relied on advantages like size, strength, or advanced technology. Humans, on the other hand, had none of those things. They were physically weaker, their weapons were not the most advanced in the galaxy, yet they moved with an eerie confidence, as if war was not just a necessity for them, but something they had mastered beyond logic. Xurek had seen warriors fight with fury, with honor, with desperation. But these humans fought with something else. Something colder, something terrifying. He was led into another facility, where a new group of cadets was undergoing an endurance test. The rules were simple. Push your body beyond its limits, ignore the pain, and keep moving forward. Xurek watched as a young soldier, barely past his adolescence, struggled under the weight of a massive pack strapped to his back. The pack was heavier than the human himself, but he did not stop. Sweat dripped from his face. His legs trembled, yet he clenched his teeth and marched forward. Another cadet beside him collapsed, gasping for breath. An instructor stepped forward, shouting at the fallen soldier, demanding that he get up. Xurek expected the cadet to beg for rest, to surrender to exhaustion, but instead he slammed his fists into the dirt, growled in frustration, and forced himself back to his feet. There was no hesitation, no complaint, just the sheer, unrelenting will to continue. Xurek felt a chill run through him. He had seen soldiers push through pain before, but this was different. This was not the desperate struggle of a warrior facing death. This was discipline, trained into them like an unbreakable instinct. He turned to Carter, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. What happens if they refuse to get up? Carter smirked, crossing his arms. They don't. Not if they want to stay in this academy. Xurek glanced back at the cadets, his unease growing. Even the weakest among them refused to quit. It was as if failure was not an option in their minds. He thought back to his own warriors, the elite Zorthan soldiers who relied on genetic modifications, strength enhancements, and pain suppressors. Would they endure the same way these humans did, with nothing but sheer willpower keeping them standing? The answer disturbed him. As they continued deeper into the training grounds, another test was taking place. This time, it was combat. Zirak observed as the cadets sparred against each other, their movements sharp and precise. But what caught his attention was not their technique, it was their unpredictability. Most species in the galaxy had structured forms of combat, built on tradition and refined through centuries. But these humans, they fought like animals. No two fighters used the same style. Some were brutal and aggressive. Others were calculating and defensive. Some baited their opponents, feigned weakness, then struck when least expected. They adapted mid-fight, changing tactics in the blink of an eye. Zirak had never seen anything like it. One cadet was thrown to the ground by his opponent, his arm twisted in an unnatural angle. Zirak expected him to cry out, to surrender. Instead, the cadet used his other arm to grab a handful of dirt and flung it into his opponent's face. The moment of distraction was enough. He twisted free, countered with a brutal strike, and sent his opponent crashing down. The match was over. The injured cadet stood, his arm clearly broken, yet he showed no sign of pain. The instructor stepped forward. "Do you require medical attention?" The cadet shook his head. "No, sir. I can keep fighting." The instructor nodded approvingly and moved on. Zirak's claws tightened at his sides. This was not normal. Pain was supposed to stop a fighter, force them to reconsider. It was a natural instinct across all species, but these humans treated pain like an inconvenience. It was then that he realized why the Zorthan Empire had failed to intimidate Earth. Threats did not work on a species that refused to acknowledge fear. Zirak had believed humans to be weak. Now he was beginning to understand the truth. They were the most dangerous kind of warriors. Not because of their technology, not because of their weapons, but because they did not know when to stop. As he followed Carter back toward the command center, he could not shake the growing dread inside him. If war ever came between Earth and the Zorthan Empire, the outcome might not be as certain as he once believed. The war simulation was about to begin, and General Zirak stood in the observation chamber, watching as the human soldiers prepared for the test. He had seen countless battle simulations across the galaxy, and he expected this to be no different. Structured, predictable, and ultimately inferior to the war tactics of the Zorthan Empire. But as the simulation began, something felt off. The battlefield was a vast, digital recreation of a war-torn city, filled with ruined buildings, smoke rising from shattered streets, and debris scattered everywhere. The human soldiers moved in teams, communicating with short, sharp commands, their movements synchronized yet unpredictable. Zirak observed closely, expecting them to rely on traditional military formations. But they didn't. Instead, they spread out in seemingly chaotic patterns, disappearing into the shadows, taking positions on rooftops, alleyways, and vantage points that most armies would ignore. Then, the enemy forces, an advanced eye-controlled army representing an invading alien force, began their assault. The enemy units moved in precise formations, their weapons glowing with energy, their strategies calculated and logical. It should have been an easy victory for them, but within minutes, the battlefield descended into chaos. The human soldiers did not fight in the traditional sense. They did not meet the enemy head-on. Instead, they lured them into traps, vanished into the ruins, struck from the darkness, and disappeared before retaliation could come. Zirak's eyes narrowed as he saw an entire enemy squad wiped out without ever seeing their attackers. The humans fought like predators, striking only when they had the advantage, adapting instantly when things went wrong. One moment, they were ambushing enemy units with precision gunfire. The next, they were planting explosives on key structures, collapsing entire buildings to cut off enemy reinforcements. There was no pattern, no predictability, only ruthless efficiency. A squad of human soldiers found themselves outnumbered and trapped in a ruined courtyard. Sirach expected them to retreat, to surrender the position and regroup. Instead, the team leader issued a single command. One of the soldiers broke away, drawing enemy fire while the others vanished into the rubble. The lone soldier fought viciously, holding the enemy's attention, buying time. Then, from the ruins above, the rest of the squad struck. Grenades rained down, snipers picked off high-priority targets, and within seconds, the enemy was annihilated. The soldier who had acted as bait was wounded, barely standing, but he had a grin on his face, as if this was nothing more than a game to him. Sirach clenched his fists. This was not war as he knew it. This was something else. There was no honor in these tactics, no sense of fair combat. The humans did not fight for glory or personal pride. They fought to win, at any cost. He had seen species that were stronger, faster, or more advanced, but none that fought with such cold, calculated brutality. Most armies had a breaking point, a moment when they realized they were losing and sought surrender or retreat. But as Sirach continued to watch, he saw no hesitation, no fear. The human soldiers did not care about losses. Even when wounded, they kept fighting, and when they knew they were doomed, they didn't waste time begging for mercy. They simply ensured they took as many enemies down with them as possible. And then, the most horrifying moment of the simulation happened. The AI enemy, realizing it was losing, deployed an overwhelming force, sending heavy artillery and airstrikes to crush the remaining human units. Sirach expected the humans to panic, to retreat. Instead, they did something insane. One of the squads, deep behind enemy lines, transmitted a final message. "Fire the payload." Sirach frowned. He turned to Carter. "What does that mean?" Carter simply smiled. And then, on the battlefield, a massive explosion erupted in the heart of the city. Not a typical explosive, not a precision strike. It was a scorched earth tactic. The humans had destroyed their own position, sacrificing themselves to eliminate the enemy. In an instant, half the battlefield was consumed in flames, wiping out everything, including the last remaining human forces. The simulation ended. Silence filled the observation chamber. Sirach felt something he had not felt in centuries. Fear. He had fought against warriors who prided themselves on their strength. He had conquered species that wielded advanced weaponry. But he had never, in all his years, seen a species that would rather destroy itself than accept defeat. Carter turned to him, his expression calm. "Now you understand. We don't fight wars to survive. We fight wars to win. And when it comes to survival, we don't have limits." Sirach did not respond. He had come to this planet expecting weakness. Instead, he had found something terrifying. A species that did not break. A species that did not surrender. A species that, if pushed to the edge, would drag the entire galaxy into the abyss just to make sure they took their enemy with them. The Zorthan Empire had made a terrible mistake. General Sirach could not ignore the growing sense of dread that coiled around his thoughts like a tightening noose. The war simulation had shaken him, but a part of him still refused to believe that these humans could be as dangerous as they appeared. He needed more proof, needed to see beyond their training and tactics. So, under the cover of night, he made his way into the Academy's restricted research facility, his tall frame moving silently through the dimly lit corridors. The humans had shown him their soldiers, their strategies, but what were they hiding? What weapons had they not revealed? As he stepped deeper into the facility, passing security doors that should have been heavily guarded but weren't, he felt an odd sensation crawling up his spine. The humans weren't protecting these secrets as heavily as they should have been. It was almost as if they didn't fear anyone discovering them. That was unsettling. Finally, he reached the inner chamber, where prototype weapons were stored and tested. His glowing eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of weapon racks, the strange devices resting on metallic tables, the blueprints pinned against the walls. At first glance, Nothing seemed too unusual. There were energy weapons, high-impact railguns, and other standard instruments of war. But then his gaze landed on a reinforced containment unit, a thick metal vault sealed with layers of security mechanisms. Zirak approached, his sharp fingers running across the cold surface, and without hesitation, he activated the console beside it, hacking into the system with ease. The humans were advanced, but they were not yet on par with Zorthan technology. The vault door hissed, then slowly began to open. As the thick steel barrier parted, Zirak was immediately hit by a wave of something wrong. He didn't know how to describe it, but the air itself felt heavier, tainted with a presence that sent a deep, primal warning through his very being. Inside the vault, resting on a raised platform, was a weapon unlike anything he had ever seen. It was not energy-based. It was not plasma. It was not anything the Zorthan Empire would consider advanced. It was something worse, something ancient, a small, compact device, its outer shell reinforced with layers of composite metal, glowing faintly with an eerie blue light pulsing from within. It looked unassuming, yet Zirak knew with every fiber of his being, that this was no ordinary weapon. He reached for it, hesitating just for a moment before his claws brushed against its cold surface. Instantly, a surge of data flooded his mind. This was not a conventional bomb, not a mere instrument of destruction. It was something that operated on principles no sane species would ever consider using. The humans had not built a weapon to defeat their enemies. They had built a weapon to erase them. Completely, irreversibly. His mind reeled as he processed the implications. The Zorthan Empire prided itself on advanced war tactics, overwhelming firepower, and precise strategic conquests. They fought wars to dominate, to subjugate, to expand their influence across the stars. But the humans fought differently. If pushed to the edge, they would not fight for survival. They would not fight for territory. They would fight for absolute victory, even if it meant annihilating everything, including themselves. Zirak had spent centuries studying war, understanding the psychology of battle, breaking the will of countless civilizations. He had always believed that every species had a limit, a threshold beyond which they would surrender, a point at which survival would outweigh pride. But the humans had no such limit. He understood now why they had survived wars that should have broken them, why they had endured centuries of conflict, why their soldiers fought with such reckless brutality. They were not afraid of destruction. They were destruction. A cold sweat formed on his ridged brow as he slowly stepped back from the weapon, his mind racing. If the Zorthan Empire ever pushed these creatures too far, if they ever tried to conquer Earth with sheer force, the humans would not bow. They would not beg for mercy. They would not accept defeat. They would burn everything to the ground, take their enemies with them, and laugh while doing it. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. "Find what you were looking for." Zirak turned sharply, his claws instinctively flexing, but it was only General Carter standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression calm. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just quiet amusement, as if he had expected this all along. Zirak exhaled slowly, his heart still pounding from the revelation. You would actually use this," he muttered, barely able to comprehend the sheer insanity of it. Carter smirked, stepping into the room and glancing at the weapon. "Only if we had no choice," he said simply. "But that's the thing, General. If we ever have to use it, it means our enemies have already lost." His words hung in the air, cold and absolute. Zirak stared at him, trying to understand the depths of the madness he was witnessing. In all his years, he had never feared an enemy. But as he stood there, facing a species that had mastered the art of total war, he finally understood the truth. The Zorthan Empire had always seen humans as weak. They had no idea what kind of monsters they were truly dealing with. Zirak did not sleep that night. He could not. The knowledge of what he had seen, What he now understood about these humans would not allow his mind to rest. He stood in the shadows of the Academy's observation tower, looking down at the training grounds below, watching as young soldiers drilled through the night. Even now, while the rest of the galaxy would be resting, these humans pushed themselves further, honed their skills, became more dangerous. It was not necessity that drove them. It was obsession. And that terrified him more than any weapon ever could. His own people, the Zorthan, were one of the most feared warrior species in the known universe. They prided themselves on discipline, on strength, on control. They fought wars with precision, calculated strategies, overwhelming force. But for the first time in his long military career, Sirak was beginning to doubt everything he had believed about warfare. He had thought of humans as a minor threat, a species that survived through luck and persistence rather than true power. Now, he knew the truth. They were the most terrifying force he had ever encountered, not because of their technology, not because of their numbers, but because they refused to accept the idea of defeat. He had seen their tactics, their brutal efficiency in combat, their willingness to sacrifice without hesitation. He had seen the weapon they had built, a weapon that did not just kill, but erased. And now, standing there in the cold night air, he understood the most dangerous truth of all. Humans did not fight wars to win. They fought wars to make sure their enemies lost in the most absolute way possible. He thought back to the Zorthan War Council, the high generals who had debated the conquest of Earth, who had dismissed the humans as primitive, as insignificant. He had agreed with them once. Now he felt only dread. The Zorthan Empire could defeat Earth in a conventional war. There was no doubt about that. Their fleets were larger, their weapons more advanced, their armies battle-hardened. But what happened after the war started? What happened when the humans realized they could not win with traditional methods? Sirak already knew the answer. They would not surrender. They would not beg for peace. They would adapt. They would escalate. And then, when they had no options left, they would unleash the kind of horror that no empire, no civilization, could ever prepare for. He clenched his fists, his sharp claws digging into his palms. If war ever came between their species, it would not be a conquest. It would not be a battle for dominance. It would be annihilation. The Zorthan Empire could burn every human city to the ground, could wipe out entire continents, could shatter their fleets in the void. And yet, somehow, Sirak knew, it still would not be enough. They would find a way to fight back. Even if they had to reduce their own planet to rubble, even if they had to drag their enemies into the abyss with them, they would never stop. He turned away from the training grounds, his mind made up. The Zorthan High Command had to be warned. They could not afford to underestimate this species, not even for a moment. Conquering them was not an option. It was suicide. But even as he prepared to leave, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You've seen enough, haven't you?" Sirak turned slowly to find General Carter standing behind him, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. The human had been watching him the entire time, as if he had expected Sirak to come to this realization on his own. Sirak met his gaze, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "I understand now," he said. "Your people, you are not like the others." Carter smirked slightly. "No, we're not." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the distant sound of boots marching, of soldiers pushing themselves through another grueling exercise. Finally, Sirak spoke again. "If my empire ever comes for Earth," he said slowly, "you will burn the stars down before you let yourselves be conquered." Carter nodded. "You're damn right we will." Sirak exhaled, feeling the weight of his realization settle in his chest like a stone. He had come to Earth expecting to evaluate a potential enemy. Instead, he had discovered something far more terrifying. He had discovered a species that did not just fight wars. They ended them, no matter the cost. Sirak left the observation tower with heavy steps, his mind consumed by the grim reality he had uncovered. The Zorthan Empire had always been victorious, always assumed itself superior. But against the humans, victory was an illusion. He had to return to his people, had to warn them that Earth was not a world to be conquered. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled with anyone foolish enough to challenge it. But as he made his way toward his transport, something unexpected happened. The Academy's alarms blared, red lights flashing across the base, and a voice rang out over the intercom. Emergency alert. Unidentified hostile forces approaching. All units to battle stations. Hilirac's first instinct was to assume this was another human test, another cruel exercise designed to push their soldiers to their limits. But then he saw them. From the sky, dark ships descended in silence, sleek, jagged vessels that bore no markings, no signs of allegiance. These were not human. They were not Zorthan. They were something else entirely, and they were here to kill. Before Xerac could react, the first explosions ripped through the Academy, sending fire and debris into the air. Soldiers were already moving, already adapting, diving for cover and returning fire before their enemy had fully landed. It was instinctive, almost inhumanly fast, while most species would be caught off guard, scrambling to understand the situation. The humans responded with terrifying precision. Xerac had never seen a force so unshaken by the sudden outbreak of war. The attackers landed, strange, insect-like creatures pouring from their ships, their weapons spitting out deadly energy bolts. Xerac recognized them immediately. Korthian mercenaries, slavers, ruthless killers that prowl the edges of the galaxy, attacking isolated worlds, taking prisoners, leaving nothing but corpses behind. He had fought them before. He knew their tactics, their savagery. And now, they had made the worst mistake of their existence. They had come to Earth. Xerac barely had time to draw his own weapon before he saw the humans charge. Not retreat, not regroup, charge. They moved like predators unleashed, striking before the enemy could establish a foothold. Xerac had seen warriors fight with fury before, but this was something else. They were precise, brutal, relentless. A squad of human cadets, barely more than trainees, engaged a group of Korthians 3 times their size. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, the humans tore through them with frightening efficiency. A young soldier took a shot to the leg, collapsing for only a second before pulling himself up and continuing to fight as if pain was nothing more than an afterthought. Another was disarmed, but didn't hesitate. He tackled a Korthian to the ground, slammed his fists into its skull, and grabbed the fallen enemy's own weapon to finish the fight. Xerac watched in stunned silence as a group of instructors, outnumbered and cornered, activated explosives at their own position, wiping out themselves and the invaders in a single calculated act of destruction. No hesitation, no fear, just war, fought without mercy. The Korthians had expected easy prey. They had expected screams, surrender, panic. Instead, they were being torn apart by something far worse than they had ever encountered. Xerac saw the moment their morale cracked, saw the first of them hesitate, saw them start to fall back. The humans sensed it too, and they did not let up. In any other battle, the enemy would have been given a chance to retreat, to regroup. But the humans didn't fight like that. They hunted. As the Korthians tried to retreat to their ships, the humans pursued, cutting them down with ruthless precision. Snipers picked off fleeing soldiers with perfect shots. Grenades landed in the center of retreating groups, ensuring no survivors. The humans did not just win battles, they erased their enemies. Within minutes, the battle was over. The Academy was damaged, but the enemy was annihilated. The Korthians had lost every single soldier they had sent. Not one had escaped. The only thing left was silence, the acrid scent of burned flesh, and the humans standing victorious amidst the ruins, their faces unreadable. Xerac let out a slow breath. The Korthians had not just been defeated. They had been utterly crushed. He turned to Carter, who stood beside him, watching the battlefield with calm detachment. "Now you see what happens," Carter said, his voice quiet, almost disappointed. "When you come to our world uninvited." HFY swallowed hard, realizing the terrifying truth. The Corthians had only sent a small force, but if they had come with a full invasion fleet, the result would have been the same. The humans would have fought, bled, and died. But they would have won, even if it meant turning their own planet to ash, even if it meant dragging their enemies into the abyss with them. Tirak had his answer now. The Zorthan Empire had no place in this war. They had no business challenging a species that saw war not as a tragedy, but as a natural state of existence. He had always believed the Zorthan were the strongest warriors in the galaxy. He had been wrong. The strongest warriors did not fight for conquest. They fought because it was all they had ever known. And nothing, not even the might of the Zorthan Empire, could survive a war against that. Tirak stood amidst the ruins of the battlefield, the acrid scent of blood and smoke filling his lungs, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He had seen wars, countless battles across the stars, but never had he seen an enemy crushed with such ruthless finality. The humans had not just repelled the Corthians, they had wiped them from existence, ensuring that not a single one left the battlefield alive. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't defense. It was extermination. He turned to General Carter, who stood calmly at his side, watching the aftermath without a hint of emotion. The human general had not given a single order, had not commanded his soldiers to fight harder or push forward. He had simply let them do what they did best, survive by any means necessary. Tirak exhaled, his claws flexing, his mind racing. If the Corthians, seasoned killers feared across the galaxy, had been nothing more than prey to these humans, then what hope did any empire have against them? Even now, the human soldiers did not celebrate their victory. There were no cheers, no boasts of dominance. Instead, they moved methodically across the battlefield, securing weapons, confirming kills, ensuring that not a single threat remained. They treated war like a routine task, like it was nothing more than an unavoidable part of life. And perhaps for them, it was. Tirak had always believed that every species fought for a reason. For conquest, for survival, for vengeance. But these humans, they fought because they knew nothing else. War had shaped them, carved them into something unnatural, something that did not fear death, that did not recognize surrender, that refused to be broken. He turned to Carter, his voice quiet, uncertain. "Why?" The human general glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Why what?" Tirak gestured to the devastation around them. "Why do you fight like this? You could have let them retreat. You could have spared some, but you didn't." Carter sighed, as if explaining something simple to a child. "Because if we let them go, they come back stronger. They learn. They adapt. Next time, they don't send a raiding force. They send an armada." He looked Tirak in the eyes, his gaze unreadable. "So we don't give them a next time." Tirak's breath caught in his throat. That was it. That was the horrifying truth of humanity's way of war. They didn't fight to win battles. They fought to end wars before they could begin. He had seen empires fight for survival before, but humans fought like an animal backed into a corner from the moment they were born, as if the universe itself was constantly trying to kill them, and they refused to let it. And if anyone made the mistake of thinking they were weak, if anyone tried to push them just a little too far, then they became something far worse than warriors. They became extinction incarnate. He had to warn the Zorthan High Command. He had to convince them that humanity was not an enemy they could afford to make. But deep down, he already knew the truth. His empire, like so many before it, would see humanity as a challenge, as a species that needed to be tested, conquered, broken. And when that day came, when the Zorthan fleets darkened Earth's skies, when they demanded surrender, they would see too late what Tirak had already come to understand. Humanity did not surrender. Humanity did not break. And if war ever came, if they were ever truly forced to fight for their existence, they would burn the stars themselves to ensure their enemies burned with them. The Zorthan Empire had survived for thousands of years, had conquered dozens of worlds, had faced every challenge with unwavering might. But against these humans, against a species that turned war into an art of absolute destruction, the Empire would face the one enemy it could never defeat, the one enemy that would never stop fighting, the one enemy that, if pushed too far, would make the entire galaxy pay the price. The war had not yet begun, but Xerac knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that when it did, the Zorthan Empire would not survive it. Xerac stood at the edge of the battlefield, the weight of his realization pressing down on him like the crushing gravity of a dying star. The Academy's fires still burned, casting eerie shadows over the blood-stained ground, but the humans were already moving forward, already rebuilding, already preparing for whatever came next. There was no hesitation, no delay, no moment of weakness. They had fought, they had won, and now they were ready for the next war, because for them, there was always a next war. Xerac clenched his fists, his sharp claws digging into his own palms. He had spent his life on battlefields, had crushed rebellions, had conquered civilizations, had watched empires crumble beneath the might of the Zorthan war machine. But never, not once, had he encountered a species like this. The humans did not fight for power, for glory, for conquest. They fought because it was in their nature, because it was the only thing the universe had ever allowed them to be. He had seen their brutality, their willingness to sacrifice everything if it meant ensuring their enemies lost. He had seen them throw themselves into battle without fear, had seen them destroy an entire invasion force with ruthless efficiency, and he had seen the weapon they had built, the monstrous, final option they kept locked away, waiting for the day they had no other choice. It was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of extinction. The Zorthan Empire had always believed that strength determined the rulers of the galaxy, that the mightiest warriors would always stand at the top. But now, Xerac understood the terrible truth. Strength alone did not guarantee survival. It was the species that refused to die, the species that refused to accept defeat, that would inherit the stars. And humans were the most dangerous survivors he had ever seen. He turned to General Carter, his voice lower now, filled with something he had not felt in centuries. Not fear, not anger, but respect. You knew this would happen, Xerac said quietly. You knew they would come. Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. They always do. There's always someone who thinks we're weak, someone who thinks we're prey. And we proved them wrong. His voice was not boastful. It was not proud. It was a simple, undeniable truth. Xerac inhaled slowly, his decision already made. There was no need to return to the Zorthan Empire. No need to warn his people. They would not listen. They would not believe. And when the day came that they decided to test humanity, when the war fleets of the Empire darkened Earth's skies, Xerac knew exactly what would happen. The Empire would strike with all its might. The humans would endure. And then, when they had no other choice, they would unleash everything. They would set the galaxy on fire before they ever allowed themselves to fall. The war would not end with a surrender. It would end with the death of an empire. Xerac exhaled and looked up at the stars. For the first time in his life, he wondered if his people had been fighting for the wrong thing all along. The Zorthan had spent centuries conquering, proving their dominance over lesser species, believing that strength was the only thing that mattered. But humanity had shown him something else. War was not about power. It was about survival. And the ones who survived were not the strongest. They were the ones who refused to lose. With one last glance at the battlefield, at the humans already preparing for their next fight, Xerac turned away. His mission was over. His answer was clear. Earth was not to be conquered. Earth was to be feared. And when the time came, when the Zorthan Empire made its fatal mistake, General Xerac would not be there to fight against the humans. No, he would be standing with them, Because in the end, only one truth mattered. Humanity did not just survive war. Humanity was war, and nothing in the universe could ever defeat that.